A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. I seek refuge in Allah from the shaitan. In the name of Allah, most gracious, most merciful. This is my PowerPoint that I've created and presentation that I've created about my theory on the war on terror, and which I believe is the war against Islam by the West and by hypocrites amongst the Muslims. This is going to cover a lot of stuff that you probably don't know, and it's going to be very educational. And a lot of it is cold-hearted facts about Islam and what's going on in history that I've studied. And the last part of it is going to be more of my speculations based upon the facts that I've found over the past couple of years. And I hope that you benefit from this. And please comment and please like this. And I'd like to hear your thoughts. So please stay tuned. Islam, you hear a lot of things about Islam in the media and the news, and the truth of the matter is that Islam is not just a religion, it is also a political system. A lot of, when you look at the definition of a religion is about a belief in a deity, and it usually has rituals surrounding it, like attending services, certain prayers, certain prescribed beliefs, and etc. Islam also does have its rituals. It has its prayers. It has its beliefs and stuff like that. But what they don't tell you, or what they kind of are suppressing, is that it's also a political system. Now, how do political systems or governments work? What is the fundamental building blocks of a political system or a government? And that is basically broken up in three powers or three types of authority. And the first authority that governments usually have are executive authority. The second is legislative authority, and the third is judicial authority. Now, executive authority is the power to enforce law. Legislative authority is the power to make law, and judicial authority is the power to settle disputes between parties and people based upon the written law made by the legislative authority. So, in layman's terms, executive authority in our understanding in America and in layman's terms, like as I said before, is like the police. They're the ones that go and enforce the law. The judicial authorities, the ones that settle disputes, are like the courts. Like the courts settle disputes based upon the law written by the legislator. The legislative authorities, like the Congress, the House, and state assemblies, who make up and vote laws in. So that's kind of how governments work, and that's kind of their power structure. Now, we're living in a world that's basically a democracy for Sharia. Democracy for Sharia. That is what we're seeing right now in the war on terror. That's kind of what they don't tell you. They tell you that basically that they're just trying to fight terrorists, but really it's a war of ideology. The ideology between democracy and Sharia. The fundamental difference between democracy and the Sharia lies in the legislative authority of government. Remember, legislative authority is the power to make or write law that gets enforced by the executive authority, like the police, FBI. So this is basically kind of like the House or the Senate or the Assembly making a law, and then the law goes on the books, and then that law can be enforced by the police and FBI and etc. So in democracy, man can make up laws as he sees fit. Man determines what is legal or illegal. For example, people in America can legalize alcohol, while people in Poland can illegalize it. In democracy, man can make up what is right and wrong, and man can make up punishments for laws broken by its subjects. So man can determine what is right and wrong, and man can determine the punishments for the subjects when they break a wrong that they supposedly broke, or a law they broke, which the legislator has come up with. All right, so democracy versus the Sharia. That's what we're living in. That's the world we're living in right now. Democracy ideology versus Sharia ideology. That's the war on terror, which I believe is fundamentally, that's the fundamental principle of what the war on terror is. It's democracy versus the Sharia. Now you have to remember that in democracy, the core creed of democracy, or the essence of it, or like the one sentence or long-tailed keyword that you can to understand democracy is for the people, by the people. That's it. For the people, by the people. Whenever you think of democracy, think of for the people, by the people. So laws in democracy can change as much as man in those systems wants it to. For example, homosexuality 20 to 30 years ago was illegal in America. But today or tomorrow, it could be legal. It could just happen based upon what man in that system wants to happen. If in America, for instance, democracy, if they vote into homosexuality to be legal, it becomes legal. If they elect certain leaders or politicians that want it to be legal and they are the majority and they vote the law, it could become legal tomorrow. So really, the democratic systems are based upon what man deems to be right and wrong, usually based upon majority or elected leaders. Basically, each democratic nation and systems are different in different nations because different people have different beliefs about right and wrong and how things ought to be run by government. Basically, one country could have beliefs on how a government ought to run, and another country can have beliefs on how that government ought to run. So basically, that's the confusing doctrine of democracy. You can go to one nation and marijuana could be legal. You can go to another nation, marijuana could be illegal. So it really changes based upon what the people want in that specific nation. So usually people have elections where people elect leaders in democratic systems. Usually the elections in democratic systems are based upon how much money, influence, and persuasive power a person has. So, the more money, the more influence, and the more persuasive power you have, the more you're liked by the people, the more you have a chance of getting elected. So we have to remember about, in democracy, the term sovereignty. Sovereignty means the right to rule. Sovereignty means the right to enforce the law, the right to write the law, the right to settle disputes based upon that law. That's what sovereignty is. You have to remember that in democracy, sovereignty, the right to rule, belongs to man. And remember, democracy is for the people, by the people. So, the difference between democracy and Islam is that basically in Islamic States, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala means God in the Arabic, just means the God. God, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is intertwined in the governmental system. And in a lot of cases, basically, democratic systems believe in separation, what they call church and state, but necessarily Islamic governments don't have concurrence in that issue. They believe that religion and state should be completely intertwined. And the major difference between democracy and the Sharia is in the legislative authority, the authority to make and write law. The fundamental difference is in Sharia, which is Islamic law, man is not allowed to make up laws as he sees fit. So man is not allowed to make up what he believes is right and wrong. In Islamic law or Sharia implemented states, laws must be extracted or taken from Islamic sources. The two major Islamic sources are the Quran and the Sunnah. The Quran is the Muslim holy book, which contains the speech of God in Arabic, while the Sunnah contains the speech of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May peace and blessings be upon him. That is the two sources that are used to make law or have law extracted from those sources. So law is not from the people by the people. Law is extracted from God and his messenger. And since you cannot talk to God and his messenger because we can't talk to him like we can't have a physical conversation with him, and because the Prophet, peace be upon him, has passed away, the Muslims are to look to God's book, which is the Quran, and to the Sunnah, which is basically the words of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So in a way, you're extracting rulings from these two sources. You're extracting rulings from God and his messenger in this case, and that's how Islamic law is legislated. And that is the fundamental difference between democracy and Sharia. Democracy, man legislates law, and in Sharia, God and his messenger legislate law. All right, so as we said before, the difference between a democracy and an Islamic state is that in an Islamic state, laws must be extracted from the Quran and the Sunnah properly, which is properly interpreted through Islamic sciences. So basically, laws must be extracted from the Quran and Sunnah, and there's certain Islamic sciences that are used to interpret it properly, so that the jurist or the scholar can extract the ruling properly and then come up with a law that Allah and His Messenger would intend to be the law of the land. For example, the Quran says that fornication, which is called zina in Arabic, which is sex before marriage, is disobedience, and Allah in the Quran prescribes a punishment for it, being 100 lashes and banishment for 1 year. Here, Allah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, legislated a law, and since God, or Allah, is a higher being than man, man cannot override the law that God prescribed. Man in the Sharia system must enforce this law and must settle the dispute by implementing this law and the punishment laid out by God. So basically, man is a creation, Allah is the creator. So because Allah is higher and has a higher status than man, because man is just a creation, man is in no position to overrule what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated. So therefore, in a Sharia system, man must enforce the law that the higher being legislated, and man cannot legislate or supersede what God already has legislated in His books. The sources that Islamic legal jurists and scholars refer to for the laws are basically, or Islamic laws, come from the Quran, Sunnah, as we've explained, and also from Ijma, which is consensus of the scholars on an issue, and also from Qiyas, which is analogy, and other sources directly related to understanding the Quran and Sunnah, where ambiguity, sorry, it's hard for me to say that word, or uncertainty exists. So, if not every law in the Quran and Sunnah is laid out clearly, like as clear as day. Overall, there is a lot that is very clear, but things that are kind of uncertain or some kind of doubt exists. There is certain things like what we said, Ijma, consensus of scholars, and analogy, or other sciences that Islamic jurists and scholars use to basically remove the doubt and remove the uncertainty to bring certainty into the issue. And that's how that issue was dealt with. Now, we have a clash, the clash between Sharia and democracy. That is the clash that we're going to talk about today. The true Islam must be implemented and upheld in its entirety. According to the Quran, chapter 2, verses 208, it says, "O you who believe," this is the English translation, by the way, "uphold Islam in its entity, as a whole." In Islam, Muslims are called by Allah to rule strictly by Islamic sources, Quran and Sunnah. The Quran says in chapter 4, verse 59, O you who believe, obey Allah and obey His Messenger and the people in authority among you. And if you dispute over anything, refer it to Allah and His Messenger if you really believe in Allah and the last day. That is the best in terms of consequences. The Quran also goes on to say in Quran chapter 5, verse 44, and he who does not rule by what Allah has revealed, it is they who are the unbelievers. So if you look at these two things, that is the clash between Sharia and democracy right there. Now, people of democracy believe that people can make law, and people of Sharia believe that law must be extracted from the Quran and the Sunnah. So basically, that's the clash. In democracy, people in their writings, okay, like in democracy and other, man ruled systems, like what they use, man in this case uses their writings, like constitutions, and then uses like different forms of sources to make law. Okay, for instance, in non-Islamic governments, people, man can refer to constitutions to rule by, or they can rule by a king, or they refer to senators and etc. This is how they refer. These are the sources they refer to for law. You had like the common law here in Britain. In Britain they had the common law, and then basically America was born, and they used the common law in some cases to refer to it to come to as a source of law. So basically, in the essence, the source of law comes from people. People in their writings. That's the source of law. And in the Sharia, remember, Allah and His Messenger are referred to for laws. So since the Quran contains the speech of Allah, Zawajal, and the Sunnah contains the speech of Muhammad, peace be upon him, they are referred to fulfill the first Quranic command. basically to refer, if you dispute over anything, refer to Allah and His Messenger if you really believe in Allah and the last day. Now, the things you'll say is, is in that verse it says, obey the people in authority among you. Now that means that the people of authority must be implementing the Sharia. If they're implementing the Sharia, then of course, then you are supposed to obey the people. But if they're not implementing the Sharia, then that verse does not apply to authority. That's not what the verse means. The verse means the people who are implementing the Sharia. So that is the clash. That is the clash. And people have to understand that since this is Muslims' religious belief, it is an act of disobedience to Allah Azza wa Jal to rule by democracy, because man's law is able to supersede the law legislated in the Quran and the Sunnah, which is disobedience. For example, in Sharia, fornication is illegal and it has a prescribed punishment as explained before. It was 100 lashes and banishment for 1 year. But if a democracy is in place, man can make fornication legal, even though Allah Azza wa Jal made it illegal. Sharia is completely destroyed by democracy because people and their sources are referred to find out legal rulings, and the Quran and the Sunnah can be superseded by man's law. So the Quran and the Sunnah can be superseded by some constitution or some senator or some king or however, whatever ideology that disbelievers implement on the people. So the fact is that once Muslims in Muslim lands are ruled by something other than Allah's laws, Quran and Sunnah, they are living in a state of shirk, which is called polytheism, or in other words, associating partners with Allah. Now, how does that work? How do you explain that? Well, according to this quote by Zarabozo from the Commentary of the 40 Hadith, Volume 1, page 221, it says, I quote, Al-Shankiti wrote, associating partners with Allah with respect to His rule and associating partners with Him in worship are one and the same thing. There is no difference between them whatsoever. Whoever follows a system or way of life other than Allah's or a legal system other than Allah's is like the one who worships an idol or prostrates to a false god. There is no difference between the two of them in any respect whatsoever. They are one and the same thing. They are both associating partners with Allah. Unquote. All right, so the clash of sovereignty. Let's go over this. In democracy, un-Islamic governments begin to legalize what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made illegal and forbid or outlaw or illegalize what Allah made legal. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made polygamy, a man with multiple wives, lawful, while man in democratic systems made polygamy illegal. Man in democracy starts making legal what Allah has made illegal, and society becomes tainted with fitna, trials and tribulations. And when man does the opposite, when man makes illegal what Allah has made legal, society becomes tainted with fitna, again, trials and tribulations. Because of this, society becomes plagued by fornication, alcohol, drugs, adultery, blasphemy, polytheism, gambling, and other vices. In Sharia, it outlaws most vices and the means that lead to vices, and society becomes orderly and in submission or servitude to the only rightful ruler, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God. In democracy, society destroys itself because all kinds of trials and tribulations completely disease the society. So now you have two groups of people. One who wants to rule by the Sharia, and one who wants to rule by man's law. Kings, constitutions, democracies, communism, etc. Whatever man's ideology can come up with. So the reason for the killing. Why do we see all this killing going on between Western governments and Islamic systems or ideologies, or what they call terrorist groups? In order to have a governmental system in place, which is actually effective or actually works, the people living in that governmental system must submit to its authority. You can't have a government and then people saying, "Oh, I don't want to submit to the authority. I don't care about the police. I don't submit to the courts and I don't submit to the police. I don't care." You can't. A government doesn't work that way. People have to be bound and be in submission or servitude to the governmental system in which is in place. For example, like if somebody murdered somebody, and the murderer in this case would have to submit to the authority of the government for punishment, and he is going to be judged by the laws of that government. Now, if the murderer does not submit, he or she will be fought until he does submit. So they'll come to arrest you, and if you don't, if you resist arrest, they'll fight you until they arrest you. And if you use deadly force or something like that, they can kill you, or to stop your threat, or they'll fight you until you submit. Does that make sense? And that's how power and government works in that case. Another example is that government has the power to collect taxes. A government in most cases collects taxes from its citizens in order to run. So people are forced to submit to the command to pay taxes. And like I said, if they don't pay taxes, they can be jailed until they do. There's many people serving federal prison sentences for evading taxes. So basically, a government sets up in a piece of land, and anybody that's refusing to submit to its authority, that refusing to pay taxes, refusing to submit to its laws, the government can come in there and imprison them, declare war upon them, and basically with the intention to make them submit, or to fight the ones that are not submitting, to deter others from not submitting, so that it can lay down its authority. So basically, once this happens, the government comes in and creates a war to fight for its sovereignty, for its right to rule, and the other side, the people that are refusing to be subjugated, can either lay down its arms and submit, or it can die in the process, or basically the governmental authority trying to fight for sovereignty may fail, and the rebels might defeat it, and therefore the sovereignty of that system fails. So basically, the reason why I bring this up is because disbelievers all around the world are doing this. They're going into lands and starting democracies, and they set up a government, or they set up a Western-backed government, and basically that has an ideology of what they want, like maybe a democratic ideology or a communist ideology or whatever ideology they want to rule with, and they declare it, and then anybody that refusing to submit or subjugate to it, or to subjugate themselves to the authority they placed in power, become seditious insurgents, and they can be fought until they are subdued, or until they accept the sovereignty of that government, or if they don't, then they can die in the process. And it's not really considered illegal under international law, because it's the person refusing to submit to legitimate governmental authority will be considered a seditious insurgent, and considered a rebel. And if he's killed, he dies as a rebel or a seditious insurgent. And governments are free from liability in many cases in that aspect. So basically, with this, democratic spreading of democracy through the sword, which I like to say, this is kind of disbelievers' way of their own. It's their own type of jihad, and they're killing millions and millions of people for this ideology. But the difference is that when Muslims do this, when they try to implement their law, their religion, it's considered terrorism. But if disbelievers fight and kill for democracy, it's called liberation. Now, if Muslims fight and kill for Sharia, it's called terrorism. So it's kind of a hypocritical stance on that subject, and more light and more knowledge has to be shed to get a better understanding of this issue. Now, this is the big one. This is probably the biggest, most misinterpreted concept in today's world, because of 9/11 and because of all the controversy surrounding Muslims on the news and media. And what is jihad? That's the question. Is jihad the killing of innocent men and women and children? Is jihad 9/11? Is jihad the Boston Marathon and other terrorist attacks? Well, the truth is, according to sources, that's not what jihad is. Let's get an understanding of what jihad actually is. Now, there's different forms of jihad. Like there's jihad against the self, jihad against, against your desires, to fight your desires, to fight your evil inclinations, and to do what God wants you to do. There's jihad in that aspect, and there's jihad like in struggling to forbid good, and to enjoin good and forbid evil. That's a form of jihad. But the kind of jihad that we're interested in is the jihad against disbelievers, and it exists in Islam. And all these hypocritical Muslim leaders that say that jihad is only for self-defense, they're lying, and they are showing signs of hypocrisy, and that's not the truth. and those who speak against what jihad really means are concealing knowledge, and they're not telling you the full truth. And like I said, so let's get into what jihad really is. I'll use Islamic sources and non-Islamic sources to tell you the truth. Let's start with a non-Islamic source. This is by an author named William L. Cleveland. He is an author that wrote a book called The History of the Modern Middle East. Now he says, I quote, what the meaning of jihad is. Now this is from, I believe he is a non-believer and just an historian. And he says, I quote, the primary meaning of jihad is armed struggle against non-Muslims for the purpose of expanding and defending the territory under Muslim rule, unquote. So in this case, of course, yeah, defending the territory under Muslim rule, that's one thing. Now, nobody will disagree with that. But jihad is also expanding the territory under Muslim rule. So when Muslims fight to expand the territory of Muslim rule, they are fighting jihad. Now, let's get into a source, an Islamic source on what jihad means. And this is by Al-Munajid. And the title of it is called The Wisdoms Behind Jihad. And you can go and click on this site here or type it in. You'll find that I extracted it from that. And in quote, it says, in Islamic terminology, jihad means the Muslims striving to make the word of Allah supreme and to establish his religion on earth. The purpose of jihad in Islam is not to kill non-Muslims. Rather, the purpose is to establish the religion of Allah on earth, to establish the rule of his Sharia, and to bring people forth from the worship of other people to the worship of the Lord of all people, from the injustice of other religions to the justice of Islam, unquote. That is a pretty deep message. So it's basically the purpose is to liberate man from man's rule to the rule of God, or to the rule of Allah. That's the purpose of jihad. To get further understanding, to get more understanding on this concept of jihad, some sources have to be looked at to get more understanding of this. Now, this is a great thing or a great concept that we're going to cover, and then this will give you a perfect understanding of what jihad is. There's a hadith, which is basically the Prophet's saying, which is found in Al-Bukhari and Muslim, which is the two Sunnah sources. It says, the Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, said, I have been ordered to fight against the people until they testify that there is none worthy of worship except Allah, and that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah, establish the prayer and give the zakat. Then if they do that, their blood and their wealth will be protected from me, except in accordance with the right of Islam, and the reckoning will be with Allah, the Exalted, unquote. Now, this can be interpreted in many ways. It can be interpreted in a very extreme form or not an extreme form. So this could be used very extremely, but let's go and find out what it really means according to scholarly sources, so that we can get a proper understanding of what this means. I'll quote. This is, like I said, this is taken from Zarabozo and a commentary of the 40 Hadith, Volume 1. And here's what it says. This hadith does not necessarily mean become Muslim or die, because guidance to Islam is strictly in the hands of Allah, the Exalted. This means that you cannot make somebody become Muslim. You cannot put a gun to somebody's head and say, become Muslim or die, because that's completely against Islam, and that's not how Islam works. The quote says, the meaning of this hadith is not that the people are fought and killed until they accept the Shahada, which means the belief of Islam, to believe that there's nothing worthy of worship but Allah, and that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. It's not. It's instead. That's what Shahada means. Instead, the meaning is that the people are to be fought until they accept the dominance of the law of Allah and withdraw their opposition. This objective can be met through many means. It can be met by fighting them. It can also be met by them accepting the law of Allah and paying the jizya. It can also be met by some sort of peace accord between the Muslims and the others, in which the word of Allah will not be opposed in any way by the non-Muslim, unquote. As stated above, the fighting is not to kill people, it's to fight them until they accept the dominance of the law of Allah. Once this is accomplished through becoming Muslim, or paying the jizya, or some other peace accord as stated above, the fighting stops. The people is meant here to mean all non-Muslims who refuse to embrace Islam or accept the law of Allah and live as citizens in the Islamic State by paying a jizya in lieu of military service, unquote. So that really gives you an understanding of what jihad means. So now you won't have any questions on what jihad means. You have a perfect understanding of what it means, or a better understanding that you had before. So, like I said, you commit it when Muslims committed when people like especially so-called Muslims commit a terrorist attack. They're not really doing jihad because the purpose of jihad is to liberate people from the rule of man to the rule of God. And if you kill them just to kill them for no reason other than killing them, then there's no liberation there. There's nothing. It's just a criminal action. There's nothing behind it. There's no guiding principle or maxim behind it. It's just simply criminal actions that result in nothing but hatred and don't do anything. And what I like to say is that this cannot be just, this is the true meaning of jihad. Now, the normal people like you and I can't just go and fight jihad against non-believers because you can't just decide to, fight jihad. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Only an Islamic sovereign authority or ruler can order something like this to take place. So if an Islamic sovereign authority is in place in power somewhere, and he or they make a decision and they're in power over a country, they have that sovereign power, they have the sovereign authority, as we talked about earlier, they can actually make the decision to go and fight jihad in this way. When just normal people like anybody just does it, just goes out and does it, then it's most likely a criminal action because you don't have the authority to do that. So the question is, who is truly Islamic in the political sense? Because there's a lot of things or a lot of concepts and notions out there that the believers in Islam and disbelievers say that who is Islamic, who's not Islamic, who's extreme, who's not extreme, and stuff like that. So who is truly Islamic in the political sense is what we'll cover. So basically, who is truly Islamic in the political sense are the ones that who are actually implementing the laws of Islam on earth by forbidding evil and enjoining good in accordance with what Allah has revealed in the Quran and the Sunnah. The Islamic ones in the political sense are the ones that are implementing jihad in order to expand the Muslim rule, as we talked about earlier. And and also politically, the ones who are implementing the hudood punishments. Hudood basically means the punishments of basically the ones that the laws to punish fornicators and adulterers, punishing those who falsely accuse people of fornication and adultery, punishing apostates by the death penalty if they don't repent, punishing drunkards, punishing thieves, highway robbers, and those waging war or rebelling against Islamic States, and those punishing murderers, and other laws and punishments found in the Quran and Sunnah. Those people who are actually implementing these hudood punishments are the ones who are Islamic in the political sense. And also the ones who denounce man-made law and only enforce laws that come from the Quran and Sunnah are also evidence of being Muslims politically. And also the ones who practice strict monotheism called Tawheed in worship and in political and legal affairs. And this is who Islamic people truly are in the political sense. And you can't say that Muslims are democratic. And those are true Muslims. Those are not true Muslims. Those are Muslims in a state of disobedience who are enforcing democratic principles or ideology or man-made ideology in their governmental systems. And those who denounce these things, even the Muslims who denounce these things that are, who denounce jihad, who denounce, implementing the Sharia, who denounce, the hudood punishments, are either ignorant, they're hypocrites, or they may be even disbelievers. So these things are part of Islam. It's no doubt about it, and you cannot ignore these things whatsoever. They're there for everybody to see, and you cannot basically just choose not to rule by it and say that you have a better way. You would be considered of hypocrisy or disbelief if you disbelieve in these things, because these are an integral part of Islam, and nobody can deny these things. All right, so the Islamic world post-World War I, before World War I. So basically, I'll just give you a small history of Islam in the Middle East and the Muslim world. Around the 600s ACE, the Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him, created an Islamic State, as discussed in earlier slides. The Islamic State was the predominant legal and political system in the Muslim world. Now, the Muslim world spreads very far. After the Prophet peace be upon him died, it spread very fast, very far. It spread to Spain, it spread to northern Africa, it spread to everywhere in the Middle East, it spread to even parts of Asia. For centuries, that area has been controlled by Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law. So the last major Islamic state or empire that we saw was the Ottoman Empire, which it fell in the 1920s. Now, I'm not going to be now the disbelievers, the Europeans, of course, had a major hand in destroying the Caliphate in the 1920s, the Ottoman Empire. They destroyed it. But I don't completely blame the Europeans or the European disbelievers and other disbelievers and hypocrites for destroying it, because it really, in the end, it really kind of was the Muslims' fault, because they were more interested in pleasing their whims and desires, and they were more interested in pleasing the disbelievers instead of pleasing Allah, God. And because of World War I, and because of European colonization of Muslim lands, and of course Muslim disobedience to following the Sharia, and of course, like I said before, Muslims wanting to imitate the disbelievers, and on the fact is that Muslims were taking loans on high interest rates from European banks that they could not pay back. And Muslims were interested in showing off and trying to please disbelievers. That's the major thing, rather than be true to their faith. And they gave up their faith, a lot of aspects of their faith, in order to become more modernized, in order to show off and be accepted by disbelievers. The Ottoman Empire fell, and Muslims were subdued, and they were controlled by disbelievers, and they were colonized. So basically, after the Ottoman Empire fell, that was basically the end of Muslim rule as we know it. Of course, then we had states that has been born since then that had pieces of Islamic rule, but definitely had traces of European colonization ideology. So basically, we haven't seen Muslim rule since the 1920s, as we saw in Afghanistan. So now we have the Muslim world after World War I and post 9/11. So that was the Muslim world right after World War I until up to 9/11. So after the World War I, just to give you I know there's a lot of details. I'm just trying to give you like a simplified, in layman terms, language. The Muslim world was broken up into countries like Syria, Jordan, Saudi, Qatar, and etc. Most of these areas were called countries. Most of these areas that are called countries, like Syria, Jordan, and all these countries, were colonized by Britain, France, and Russia, and other Western powers. They actually went in there and colonized it. Once the colonizers left those areas, they placed people in power who were part of that population, the indigenous population, in there. But basically they didn't rule their people. Once the colonizers left, the Islamic law never set foot back into those those former colonies. And so what the people did is they blended Sharia with the ideology of the colonizers. That could have been democracy. It could have been a form of democracy, a form of communism, a form of kingship, autocracy. Sorry, I can't say that right. And authoritarian. This is hard for me to say too. Authoritarianism. Okay, sorry if I can't say that right. But basically, any ideology that was the ideology of the colonizer. After the colonizers left, the rulers, the Arab rulers, and the indigenous rulers of that areas used a blend of Sharia with, of course, the colonizers' ideology. So it was like a blend of communism and a blend of Sharia at the same time, a blend of democracy, a blend of Sharia, a blend of kingship, and a blend of Sharia. That's how it was. So basically, their whole intent was to stop this. They came in there, and their intention was to stop the spread or the rise of Islam. That was the most important thing. So basically, the colonizers left the area, but then he gave the ruler there, the indigenous ruler there, weapons, resources, and stuff like that to control that piece of land, to make sure that Islam did not rise, or that Islamic law was not to be implemented in its entirety. And basically, people were afraid to overthrow the leader because they were backed by the West. So if they did eventually defeat the leader, the West would come in and destroy everybody. So it would be like they'd be very scared and they wouldn't want to do anything because the indigenous ruler had a lot of power behind him, and he could definitely call upon his former colonizer for weapons and money and stuff like that to fight off to fight off threats that are going on. So they put the fear in people, and people have been oppressed by these Western-backed rulers in the Muslim world since the 1920s. Just to give you just a realistic example of what was going on in Mali, you had the rise of Islam in Mali. In Timbuktu, a group implemented the Sharia there, implemented Islamic law, and that the people in the Mali government, the Western-backed Mali government, couldn't fight them off. So as soon as they couldn't do that, guess who comes in and fights them off for them? France, the former colonizer. So this is a perfect example of what goes on, and it's been going on for a long, long time, for centuries. Colonization has done this, has done this in many cases. If you look at even during the time of Isa, Jesus, peace be upon him, time, Israel or Palestine, I'm sorry, Palestine at the time was colonized by Rome. And basically, if they put Rome put Jewish leaders in place, and basically they would control that population for them. And if anybody rose against like Jesus, Isa, peace be upon him, was creating trials and tribulations for the Roman colony in that area, and basically they used the Jews to basically take that threat out. So they tried to kill Jesus, peace be upon him. They conspired to kill him because he was disrupting the colony in Rome. And if you study that, you'll kind of find that to be true also. So what do we have in Afghanistan in post 9/11? Here's the question. The truth is, in 1996, the Taliban created created an Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So basically, this was the creation of the first another Islamic state, like it was before the 1920s, where a state was completely and controlled by the Sharia. So basically, there was not a blend of Sharia and a blend of some other man-made ideology. It was a complete ideology based upon Sharia. It means that laws were taken from the Quran and Sunnah, and then all alien ideology was taken out for the most part. So this was a state that was implementing the Sharia, as we explained before. This was the first major emergence of an Islamic state, as we've seen them before the 1920s. And of course, as soon as this started happening, disbelievers and hypocrites all over the world became fearful that this ideology would spread, and the Western-backed regimes in the Middle East would fall to this ideology, because it's such a powerful ideology that spreads very fast. Because it's an ideology, true Sharia ideology is backed by God, because it comes from God's revelation, and other ideologies like constitutions and rights and all this stuff that disbelievers and come up with is not very powerful, and it does not stand in an equal pedestal as the Sharia, because the Sharia comes from God and other ideologies simply come from man. They're just man's opinion. That's all it is. So this became a major crisis for the children of the colonizers of the Middle East. This ideology directly threatened their power and influence in the Middle East. So once Sharia rises in the Middle East, and once Islamic States rise, of course, all the power and influence that foreign governments and foreign peoples have in that area diminishes completely, because they are not following the Sharia, and people that follow the Sharia strictly only align themselves with people that are also on the same creed or akida, as we call it in Arabic. So anyway, those were the facts that I came up with through my study and through my research, and those are not really open to speculation. Those are facts. Now, these next couple slides are going to be my speculations on what I think the war on terrorism, and terrorism really isn't where terrorism comes from, and basically on how disbelievers and how hypocrites in the Muslim world and Muslims all view this, and kind of like what I think is really going on. What I think people don't have the heart to say, and I think some people know it, but I don't think they have the heart to say. I think that because Israel is in the Middle East at this point, I think that has a lot to do with the war on terrorism, because you have to understand that Jews and Arabs have existed during Abraham. You know, their origin is from the children of Abraham. May peace upon him be peace. Uh, Abraham was a prophet. He was basically the father of monotheism, and he had two wives, or basically he had two. I don't know if Hagar was considered his wife. I have to study that myself. But he had children by two women. Okay, he had children by Sarah and one children by Hagar. And two sons came out. One from Sarah was named Isaac, and the other one, may peace be upon him, and the other one was Ishmael, which came out of Hagar. Who was the father of the Arabs. So remember, Isaac was the father of the Jews, and Hagar was the father of the Arabs. Both were born from one of the greatest men that ever lived, and both were blessed by God to make great nations. So basically, the Jews believe that that they're better than that they're more accepted by God than the Arabs, and the Arabs believe that Ishmael was also blessed by God, and they don't have as much jealousy, but they do have jealousy. It does exist. There is jealousy. There is jealousy and rivalry between these two tribes. And basically, Ishmael was the firstborn son, and Isaac was the secondborn son. And usually, the blessings go with the firstborn son. And if you even study the scriptures, you'll even find that to be the truth. So the bottom line is, most of the prophets came from the line of Isaac. Like you had great prophets that came out of him: Musa, Moses, Isa, Jesus. And all these prophets that came out of him. And then you had the greatest prophet that came out of Ishmael, which was Prophet Muhammad, may peace and blessings be upon him. But through jealousy and envy, the Jews don't accept that. They look down upon the Ishmael, and they feel that they're better than Ishmael. And this hatred has been going on for since the time that these two sons were born. You'll see evidence of that. So a lot of these wars that are going on have to do with this jealousy and this envy, which you can definitely see in Jews and Arabs when you talk to them. That you'll see a jealousy and envy towards each other. I think that has a lot to do with what's going on between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East and in Israel. So the bottom line is, we know that this rivalry exists, and this jealousy and envy exists between the Arabs and the Jews. That is definitely a truth. But the bottom line, in America, we have Christian and Jewish Zionists, which definitely dominate the political arena of America. There's no question that Jewish Zionists are definitely a dominant force and a very influential force in American politics, and also what you call Christian Zionists, basically these evangelical Christians who believe in the Zionist doctrine, are huge influence on American politics. I mean, you can't deny that fact. I mean, if you in American politics denounce Jewish people in any way, for more than likely you're going to be basically casted out. And in order to become successful in politics in America, you have to be Zionist loving. I mean, that's like one of the major things you'll see. Like Ted Cruz, who's one of the major political giants in America, is like absolutely insane for Israel. I mean, he has an insane extremist view of Israel, and you'll see many of these American politicians that have this. So the bottom line is they're very, very pro-Israel. They'll be very, very against Islam and Palestinian, and they'll be very against that because they want the Jewish people and the Jews and the Zionists to be the dominant force in the Middle East. So you'll find a natural hatred towards Muslims and Arabs in American politicians because they're very pro-Israel. Basically, we have to understand that Arab Muslims, I'm not talking about just like, I have to use this as in a national racial. Islam is definitely against racism and nationalism and tribalism. Okay, that's definitely against it. But of course, these people, the reason why I bring this up, and I'm not trying to be tribalistic or racist or any aspect, but you have to understand that these people, these politicians, are all about race and all about tribalism and all about nationalism, which is disgusting. It's a sickness, but they're all about arrogance. Okay, so the Jewish people, the Jewish Zionists, they feel themselves to be superior to most people. If you'll see that trait in many Zionists, that they feel that they're superior to everybody. And the bottom line is that when Muslims were implementing the Sharia in the Middle East, they became an empire. And because they implemented the Sharia, because they was of such a powerful force and such a unifying force, they ruled almost the entire world. Maybe 3/4 or half of the entire world was ruled by the Sharia or implemented by the Sharia. So you have to understand that the Sharia is a very powerful force. So of course now the Jewish Zionists, they want to be the dominant force in the Middle East. So if they see uh, anything going that could be threaten their power in the Middle East, they definitely will fight against that and try to use their political influence to lessen that or to destroy that. And so, as you can see, they do not. The Jewish Zionists and backed by the West want to be the dominant force in the Middle East. They want to control the Middle East. They don't want to see the rise of Islam because they want to be the dominant force in the Middle East. So, of course, Sharia being implemented will unify Muslims, and it's a very powerful driving force. So, of course, because they want the resources, they want to be the dominant in the force in the Middle East. Any rise of Islam, they're going to destroy, and they're going to use their influence to destroy, and they'll do everything they can to destroy it. So remember that anything that threatens their influence or rule in the Middle East, they naturally will use their resources and political influence in America and governments all around the world to fight off the threats to them. The bottom line is that Jewish people are very influential. I'm sorry, not Jewish people, but Zionists. There's a difference between Jewish people and Zionists, because there's many great Jewish people, but Zionists are doing some very bad things in the world. Zionists will use, if they see any rise of Islam anywhere, any threat to their power and influence, they will naturally use their resources and political influence in America and governments that support them to fight off the threats for them. A lot of people say that that the war in Iraq was the predominant reason the war in Iraq was fought was because Iraq or Saddam Hussein was posing a direct threat to Israel. So America went in and fought him off. That's one of the theories. Basically, you have to understand that an Islamic State, when it's implemented properly, threatens the existence of Israel in the Middle East. Because remember, when Sharia is implemented, it unifies Muslims under one nation or rule and naturally destroys all governments, colonizers created in the Middle East with the intention to stop Islamic rule. Keeping Muslims in states like Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and all these different states they put keeps Muslims divided and conquered. They fight over imaginary borderlines in the fight to be better than the other. So they're divided and conquered and hating each other. So basically remember, Islamic rule unifies Muslims. This nationalism, tribalism divides and conquers Muslims. So more of my theories and speculations. So after World War I, European colonizers created Western-backed states in the Middle East and supported tyrants whose sole intention was to prevent and crush anybody wanting to create an Islamic State. So they backed like the Egyptian Prime Minister was named Mubarak, and they backed Assad, and they backed Saddam Hussein, and the Shah of Iran, different states, different governments who would crush anybody that would rebel against them, and the West would back that government, even though they knew that government was oppressing and doing horrible things to the Muslims in those countries, but they backed it because they wanted to stop Islamic rule. So anybody that wanted Islamic rule, they used they put those states and those rulers in place to crush that movement, and they crushed it with no conscience whatsoever. And I think when they went too far in crushing dissidents and crushing rebels, I think that's when and people started. I think that's when the West started trying to change their strategies in the Middle East. I think that the reason why terrorism or this war on terror started, I don't like to use terrorism in every aspect, is that also Muslims started waking up and they found out they had been colonized and the Sharia was destroyed. They found out that they had been colonized by foreign forces, and they found out the Islamic rule was destroyed and they were completely controlled by an alien ideology. And I think Muslims started waking up to that. So as Muslims started waking up, different Islamic groups began to rebel against Western-backed authorities and started attempting to create Islamic states. They found out they were colonized. They didn't want to be colonized by the West anymore, so they didn't accept the authority of the Western-backed governments placed there, and they started trying to attempt to create Islamic States to implement the Sharia, to fight against colonization and to implement their way of life. So as we can see, this was happening. This ideology was spreading. It was growing. The rise of Islam was happening in the political sense. And Israel and Western governments began to see the rise of Islam again, and they started arming the Western-backed governments in the Middle East to crush them. I believe they started seeing it, and they went to them, hey, you need to fight these people immediately. You need to crush this immediately. If you don't do it, we're going to do something to you. They probably threatened them, whatever they did. They did everything they could do to crush, to help the Western-backed governments to crush this Islamic rise, or the rise of Islam, or the rise of political Islam, crush it immediately. So they gave them all the power to do that. So Afghanistan started getting stronger, and the ideas of the Islamic State started becoming a reality for the first time in 90 years of 90 years of occupation and oppression. Finally, for the first time, Afghanistan started creating the Islamic State that existed for 1400 years before the 90 years of colonization. So Islam was rising again, and the Western-backed government's rule was deteriorating, and this caused the disbelievers to and the West and hypocrites in power in the Muslim world to be fearful, and they had to conspire to do something to stop the rise of Islam happening at this point. So we have 9/11. 9/11 happens. It was a tragedy. I mean, anybody that can come to any conclusion that all those innocent people dying was a horrible tragedy, and even as a Muslim, I say that was completely wrong. And the people that were killed, or whoever did it, it was a horrible crime, and it was just unexplainable pain and suffering that can never be healed, and definitely not an Islamic thing to do. So anyway, 9/11 happens. Now, whether this happened the way they say it did or it didn't, it still happened. However it happened, it happened. It was heartbreaking. It happened, okay? So after this point, 9/11 happens, and the U.S. says that Al-Qaeda is responsible for it. Now, Al-Qaeda was, in Afghanistan at the time, according to evidence, and they were collaborating with the Taliban, and they were part of this new Islamic Emirate that was in Afghanistan at that time. So after 9/11, war was brought to Afghanistan by multiple nations, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan ceases to exist as we know it, or as it was once known. So, after 9/11, people didn't really question the government in this sense, because they felt a lot of vengeance, and they were hurt and they were suffering from 9/11, and they just basically gave the government a blank check to go and fight whoever was responsible for this. Then as the years went by on the war on terror, or what's called the Operation Enduring Freedom, I believe, is implemented by the U.S. and other Western governments. So they actually call this war a war on terrorism, or Operation Enduring Freedom. Then, over the course of years, we see multiple operations and drone strikes are implemented all over the Muslim world: Yemen, Libya, Pakistan, and etc., Afghanistan. Thousands and thousands upon Muslims die by the hands of America and Western governments and Western-backed governments because of these operations. Now, my speculations on 9/11 are vary, and like I said, these are my speculations, and like I said, I haven't, like I said, we believe most people believe that there's some kind of conspiracy involved with 9/11. I mean, most people believe that. I mean, most people believe that the government is not telling us the full truth on what happened on 9/11, and a lot of people believe that. And I can find very few people that truly believe everything the government says that what happened on 9/11 is completely true. Most people believe that there's some conspiracy that they're not telling us went on in 9/11. And my speculations are this. Now, like I said, my speculations might be completely off, but these are my speculations. I believe that 9/11 may have been orchestrated by people in positions of power who wanted to use it as a pretext to make war on the Muslim world in order to stop the emergence of Islamic states. So I believe that it could have been orchestrated by people who were who did not want to see the re-emergence of Islamic states, and they saw the rise of Islam happening in Afghanistan, and they couldn't just go in there and just start fighting and killing them because they look like the bad guy. So I believe that they could have created an incident like this, like a terrorist attack, and blamed it upon them, and now they would have a humanitarian or a justifiable reason to go and fight them, to make it look like they are just trying to bring justice, to the people that were killed on 9/11. But in reality, their agenda is to stop the emergence of these Islamic states, or to stop the emergence of the rise of Islam, and to stop the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, to stop that ideology immediately before it becomes too strong or too dominant. Also, 9/11 may have been done by Muslims who were responding to the years of oppression, murder, torture, and tyrannical rule by Western governments and Western-backed governments. That's what it could be that too. It could be, like these Muslims were being killed, tortured, bombed for the past 90 years, put in prison, and especially and basically they could not fight back to fight back properly, and so they did this in order to respond to the oppression. That was how they responded to their oppression and murder and torture by Western-backed governments. That could have been one of the reasons why they did it. The next reason may have been it could have been done by Muslims who wanted to fight back, but because they could not fight they could not fight the West, because the West is a superior military power and has better technology, and all they have is maybe RPGs and rifles. They succumbed to dirty terrorist tactics in order to inflict pain and injury on its enemy, because they could not do it on the battlefield. So it's basically saying that that they are poor, they don't have the means to fight, and they could not inflict damage upon a superior military power with better technology. So in order to inflict damage and pain and injury, they succumb to terrorist attacks in order to inflict pain and injury. That could be another theory of why they do it. Also, my next theory is that 9/11 may have been orchestrated by Israel, who wanted to use it to manipulate powerful Western governments to go in and fight off threats for them. So Israel could have seen this reemergence and the rise of Islam or Islamic States as a direct threat to their existence, and instead of them fighting it themselves, they may have created in 9/11, in this case, to get people to fight the Muslims for them. That could have been another reason for 9/11. Or it could have been very well exactly how the U.S. government states, which I highly doubt, which most people highly doubt, that the government, that they don't trust the government on that issue. They highly doubt it. So those are my speculations on what I believe why 9/11 happened. Another thing that kind of like makes me believe that the war on terror is a war on Islam is because of the Federal Register. If you look at the Federal Register, it is the official journal of the United States, and in it you will find most any group calling for the Islamic law, or calling for the Islamic law to be implemented as the law of the land, are called terrorist groups. And you can click on this link or type in this link, and you'll find all the groups that the U.S. considers terrorists. So it's kind of funny is that any group that wants to implement the Sharia as the law of the land is considered a terrorist group. And when they are considered a terrorist group, that means they can be are considered enemies, and they can be fought and killed. And the other thing about it is that anybody that does any business with any of these groups, like by giving them material support or money or fighting for them or associating with them in many ways, can get up to 20 years in federal prison. Politicians and news media say that the war on terror is a war on extremist Islam. But in reality, it is a war on political Islam in order to prevent the re-emergence of an Ottoman-like empire caliphate, which dominated most of the known world. So in this case, my speculation is that the war on terror is, in my opinion, a war to keep and implement democracy in the Middle East, suppress the rise of Islam, and keep Israel as the dominant power in the Middle East, and to keep the free flow of oil coming from the Middle East. So my speculation on why we have Islamic terrorism. Why do we have Islamic terrorism? What I believe many groups of Muslims are scattered throughout the Muslim world, are starting to rebel against these Western-backed governments in the Middle East. And they're starting to rebel because they want to implement the Sharia as the law of the land. So they can't implement the Sharia with the Western-backed government because the Western-backed government is in place to stop the Sharia from being implemented. So they have it's an enigma. It's a paradox. They cannot coexist. So Western governments and Arab-backed Western governments are going into these areas of these people rebelling, and they're killing them continually in order to control the land with the ruling system which is implemented by the Western-backed governments. And God only knows how many of them they are killing on a daily basis, because nobody questions. Not many people are questioning the so-called seditious insurgents they're killing on a daily basis through drone strikes, through hellfire missiles, through night raids, and through all these different war tactics they're using. Nobody's really and the CIA is doing covert operations that we don't even know about. We don't Allahu Alam. It means Allah knows what kind of sick killings is going on that we don't even know about. That the people who are actually getting killed are the only ones that really know about it, for the most part. So basically, you have groups of Muslims who are refusing Western-backed authority in order to implement the Sharia, and they do not have state-of-art weapons and warfare technology. They don't have drones, and they don't have these missiles they can shoot from hundreds of miles away. But the ones that are fighting them do have jets, and they do have Apache helicopters, and they do have missiles that can be fired from ships hundreds of miles away, and they can kill people, in a way that is very technologically advanced. There are in many cases, these so-called seditious insurgents, or these people that are trying to implement Sharia law and refusing Western-backed authority in the Middle East, are killed by drone strikes, missiles, helicopters, bombs, and they don't have the means or the opportunity to fight back properly because a rifle can't shoot down a jet or a helicopter in most cases. Okay, so you got to have pretty good military technology to shoot down a jet or to shoot down a helicopter. So they don't have it. So they're not able to fight back in an equal manner. So basically, the bottom line is these Muslims that are refusing Western-backed authority are suffering extensively by the hands of these governments, and more than likely, nobody cares about their suffering, and they cannot get the vengeance or the justice they want on the battlefield because they cannot fight a superior military technology. So their hatred and their want for vengeance and justice, in order to satisfy that feeling within them, they succumb to terrorist attacks on their enemies because that is the only means they have to hurt their enemies. That's what I believe one of the reasons of terrorism exists. My speculation is that terrorist attacks by Muslims on the West and Western-backed regimes and people subjugated to these regimes are them responding to the attacks on them, and that is the only way they can inflict damage on their enemies because they're not able to do it on the battlefield. If that makes sense. And we just saw this new story of the Taliban supposedly the Taliban in Pakistan, massacring 133 school children. But if you read the article, which is pasted right here, it says, I quote, the head of the hardline Islamabad mosque Friday called an army offensive against the Taliban un-Islamic and said the militants' massacre of 133 children was in retaliation for airstrikes against them. And the source is right there. So, for the most part, people generally don't go on massive killing sprees, and just to kill innocent people. Usually they kill people because they have a political agenda or they're responding to attacks against them. That's usually why terrorist attacks happen. That's basically the gist of terrorist attacks. They have to have something behind it. Usually they're not just blind criminal attacks. So anyway, of course I can't talk about this presentation and not talk about ISIS. My thoughts and speculations about ISIS. Okay, the truth, a lot of people were wondering, where did ISIS get all these weapons? Where did they come from? They just came out of nowhere, and it just came and took over, conquered huge amounts of areas, and started implementing a government and controlling areas and doing all this. Where did it come from? A lot of people were confused. But I was reading the news and I came across this article that I posted right here. You'll see in the first bullet point. you can read yourself. Basically, the article said if there was no American prison in Iraq, there would be no ISIS. So basically, this article kind of spilled the beans on how ISIS came into existence and where they came from. Basically, in the Middle East, you had old ruling systems in the Muslim world in which colonizers placed in power after World War One. After World War One, after World War One, Muslim colonizers placed all these rulers in the Middle East to rule Muslims there with an iron fist to keep them from implementing the Sharia and basically forming another Ottoman empire. For example, in Egypt, recently, these old tyrants that the West put in power and hypocrites put in power over there, with the advent of new technology and basically the internet and people started getting different ideas, you had a huge rise in a rise in Egypt, and millions of people took to the streets in Egypt to basically protest against, I think his name was Mubarak there. And in Libya, people started to rebel against Gaddafi. And in Syria, people started to rebel against Assad, if you remember. Basically, the old ruler in Egypt was toppled. He wasn't killed. I think he just left power. And Gaddafi was actually killed, and a new ruling system took in place. Now that whole country is in chaos at this point. And in Syria, people started getting the same ideas, and they wanted to rebel against Assad himself. And they wanted to do this. They wanted to do the same thing in Egypt and in Libya, and they wanted to take Assad over and basically install a new government and a new ideology. But Assad didn't want to be like the other one, so he put up a fight. And since he put up a fight, over 200,000 people have been killed since that, and he is responsible for doing a lot of damage and for committing a lot of war crimes and killing anybody that got in his way. We saw him killing innocents, and so we saw a lot of bad things, and a lot of governments wanted to do something about it, and basically a lot of people wanted to see a democracy spread in Syria, and with this crisis going on, this was a perfect opportunity to topple Assad and implement a democracy. But America just got done fighting a war in Iraq. America's fighting a war in Syria. America didn't want to go to see another ground war. So instead of sending American troops, Obama and the American regime at this time, basically went and trained and found people to fight Assad for them, and they armed them. And this army was called the FCA, Free Syrian Army. And America gave them weapons, money, and resources to fight Assad. And their intention was to topple Assad and implement a democracy. But the bottom line is the FCA was basically defeated, and they were not powerful enough to topple Assad. So America looks for other groups to fight Assad, and this is exactly where ISIS fits into the picture. Because the FCA couldn't do it, and now the America had to find a more powerful, unified force to take out Assad, and they armed them. So let's get into this situation. All right, so getting more into this ISIS thing. When America went into Iraq to fight the war there, they incarcerated many Iraqis and so-called jihadists in their prisons. And according to this article that I'll post a link on the bottom in the description, you can read it for yourself. The ISIS members were put in these prison, and this is where they came together and they formulated their plan to create what's known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Levant and whatever they say. Basically, they formulated their plan in the jail, in the prison there, and it's even in that article. And they even interviewed a member of ISIS, and who was thankful to the American government for incarcerating them because that's where they formulated their plot. So, according to this article, my theory, and the article kind of points this out, is that the ISIS members tricked the U.S. government into being peacemakers who wanted to fight Assad and to implement a democracy. So basically, the FCA, the Free Syrian Army, did not do the job of toppling Assad, and America did not want to send ground troops into Syria to defeat Assad because of the the things that he was doing. So America looked for a different group, a more powerful group, so-called moderate group, to fight Assad. So I think according to this, they met with ISIS members, and ISIS tricked the U.S. government, and and they did such a good job of tricking the U.S. government that America armed them and gave them money and power and resources and weapons to fight. And as soon as they got that, they, instead of doing what they were supposed to do by following what America wanted them to do, they did their plot. The plot that they did in prison, they implemented that. And so this is where they got their weapons, and this is where they came from. They got their weapons from America, according to this article. If you kind of look through the lines, and you can kind of see this. And also, they probably got their weapons from Syria when they took over areas of Syria. They took those weapons, and of course, when Libya fell, they probably took weapons from there. And this is where the ISIS got their weapons, and this is where they got their money, and this is where they got their power and means, and this is where they met in the prison to formulate their plot there. And then after ISIS took control of a lot of areas, the U.S. government sent advisors, American advisors, to assess the situation, meaning they sent advisors to strategize how to kill ISIS. And as soon as there was a humanitarian crisis involving the Yazidis stuck on a mountain in America, America used that to start dropping bombs on ISIS targets and territories. Basically, they found some kind of humanitarian crisis, and as soon as that crisis happened, then they got into the fight against ISIS. Basically, you have to remember remember when James Foley had his head cut off, the American journalist. Everybody remembers that video, and nobody, I don't think, forgets that. And this was the major turning point against ISIS by America. They saw it as a terrorist attack, and it was very gruesome, and it touched the heart of many people. And of course, nobody wanted to see that happen. And that was a very terrible situation, and it was a tragedy for everybody to see that happen. But like I said. But just before they cut James Foley's head off, America dropped about 90 to 100 bombs on ISIS, and ISIS was very heated, and they wanted vengeance against America because of the 90 to 100 bombs dropped on them, which killed many ISIS members. And they had no way to inflict vengeance upon America because America at the time was a heavy military force, heavy technology, and they couldn't infiltrate the base there. In Iraq, in Baghdad, because it's so heavily guarded. They couldn't inflict any damage on America to be in vengeance or injustice to the 90 to 100 bombs dropped on them. So since they couldn't fight the superior military force, they wanted to inflict some type of pain and damage on America. So of course they found James Foley, an innocent journalist, who basically was part of America, and they cut his head off in order to hurt and inflict pain on their enemy in a dirty way, because that's the only way they could, because they didn't have the military technology to inflict damage upon America at that time. So that is how terrorism happens. I think, as we pointed out, terrorism happens when a group of people cannot inflict damage upon a superior military force, so they succumb to dirty tactics to kill, to inflict some type of pain and damage on their enemy in the way they can. And terrorism is usually a way to inflict that pain and suffering and damage upon an enemy on targets and things that normal people would not do. And I believe that is the origin of terrorism itself. Basically, and after the beheading, it was airstrike after airstrike on ISIS in order to maintain the Western-backed Iraqi government's rule in that area. So, they had the Shia government there, who was not controlling the land properly. He was being unfair to Sunnis and being more in favor of Shias. There was a lot of Sunni-Shia tribalism going on, and basically the Sunnis were fed up with the way the Shia Iraqi government, Western-backed government, was acting. So when ISIS came, it was kind of an alternative to the discrimination they were facing from the Shia-led governments. So basically, the reason why America started dropping these bombs was to help the Iraqi government take control of the region again, so that they can maintain power and influence in that region. So that was my speculations on what terrorism really is, what Islamic law is, stuff like that. My speculations, and of course, in the first part, those are facts. Those are facts that and speculations that I would just like to put out there so people can think about, and people can realize maybe some things they didn't know, or maybe I brought some bit more perspective on the issue that people may not see. Um, I'm sure that a lot of people is not going to like what I'm going to say. I'll probably get a lot of negative comments. I'll probably get a lot of thumbs down. But I'm sure the people that are more open-minded and not very hateful towards different ideas than they have may like this and may kind of learn something from it. The bottom line is, I really like to see peace in the world, and I don't like to see bloodshed, of course. And I think the ways to defeat this, the ways to defeat what you call this killing, I think, is not to defeat and kill other people. I think it's basically to accept truth and basically accept the truth. I think that and accept the truth of reality, and I think that would probably help to diffuse a lot of these situations that are going on based upon these things. So the things we can do from here um, is basically accept the fact that Islam is rising everywhere. Political Islam is rising everywhere. You can see that. The evidence is that is everywhere. Political Islam is rising. And the bottom line is Islam is rituals, is a form of ritual and a religious belief, but it also is a political system. And people have to accept that Islam is a political system and a religion at the same time. And and by going into Muslim land and suppressing these movements and by killing and oppressing these movements would only create hatred for the oppressor. And oppressors will never, that's it's not gonna, it's oppressing people from doing what they want to do and from their beliefs is never a good idea because it's just going to create hatred and more terrorism to the people that are oppressing. And the fact is that a lot of citizens of America and the West are not wanting to oppress Muslims, but it's basically people in positions of power that are wanting to oppress Muslims. And the bottom line is when the terrorist acts happen on both sides, it's usually the innocent people that suffer and not the people that are actually implementing these hateful policies and doing all this. So it creates terrorism and more hatred against innocent people who have nothing to do with the situation. Another thing America should do is get away from being dependent upon Middle Eastern oil. We have plenty of oil in this country to survive. I think the best way to stop being getting a lot of these wars is to get dependent upon our own oil. I think that's a good one. And another thing America should do, what I suggest to do, is basically stop electing leaders that have extreme Christian beliefs who are excessively pro-Israel. Now, of course, to be somewhat, I mean, it's likely not to find, you can't find somebody that does not support Israel in some fashion, okay? Of course, you have to support Israel in some fashion to survive in American politics. But basically, we should stay with people that have an excessive liking for Israel, which is excessive, which you can see it when you see it. When you see it, you'll know that it's excessive, and we should stop. We should get away from electing, these extreme evangelical Christians who have this crazy belief about being pro-Israel and anti-Muslim. That is, we should stop electing leaders like that. If we find beliefs of extreme Christian beliefs, extreme pro-Israel, that should be a red flag right there. The next thing you should do is find leaders. If leaders have a strong bias against Muslims and Islam, don't elect them because that is basically they're going to put their hate. The hate's going to come out some way, and if they're in positions of power, of course that hate's going to come out. So don't elect leaders that have a strong bias against Muslims and Islam. Uh, also, basically, and American politicians who are acting in the interest of Israel and not the United States should be deported or should be basically investigated. At least investigated to see, the bottom line is if somebody was spying for Russia, they would be put in prison. But if somebody was spying for Israel, for the most part, they're not put in prison. The bottom line is when you're an American politician, you act in the interest of your country and not in the interest of a foreign country. Okay, yeah, I understand that Israel is an ally of the United States and that, the United States should support them because it's an ally, according to many politicians. I can understand that. I'm not going to deny that. But the ones that are really in American politics to simply act in the interest of Israel and use America for the furtherance of Israel, they should be definitely investigated, and to see if what they're doing, and to see if they're truly acting in the interest of our country or the interest of Israel. If they're acting only in the interest of Israel or predominantly for Israel, they should be kicked out and they should be sent back to their country. And the next thing we should do is that basically, look, Islamic rule or Islamic law has ruled that area for the past 1400 years, and Muslims are very strong over there, and it's not going to go away. And the major thing we can do to stop a lot of this bloodshed is to simply accept that that is how that part of the world operates. Islamic law is how that part of that world operates. You can oppress them for a while, but eventually it's going to come out, and Islamic law is going to root. It's going to root no matter what happens. Oppression only lasts so long. So that is part of their belief, and it's just basically to come into acceptance of how that part of the world operates. And the next thing you have to do is accept that political Islam is not concurrent with democracy. Okay, there's no way that democracy and political Islam can coexist. Either one or the other is going to take root, and more than likely in the land in the Middle East, political Islam will overtake democracy because it is more in their belief than democracy. Another thing we should do is help rebuild the Middle East that was destroyed by the War on Terror. There's a lot of hatred against us for all these operations that's been taking place by the CIA and by these drone strikes, and we should help rebuild certain areas to give us a better name, and to just to get out as much as fast as possible, would also leave a good name when you get out, so that you're not hated even more. Just basically work to rebuild a reputation in the Middle East as being a friend of Islam and not a foe of Islam. I understand that we have many crazy evangelical Christians here that are an enemy of Islam, but Islam is just how that part of the world operates, and that acceptance has to be part of that. And killing and all this stuff is not going to stop the spread of political Islam. It's just going to happen, and because that's the people's religious belief, and killing millions of people to stop the rise of political Islam is only going to make it probably rise stronger and probably more brutal than ever, because they probably feel that they are been oppressed for so long, and they're probably going to be more brutal that way. And so I think just acceptance, and to get off of Middle Eastern oil, and to stop electing these crazy evangelical Christians that are excessively pro-Zionist or pro-Israel is a way probably to stop a lot of this killing. Anyway, I appreciate you listening, and I hope this helped you or benefited you somehow, and I wish you peace.